growing to love Dartmouth, I believe, from everything I see and hear. And he's doing a terrific job on the Historical Commission. And he's been very useful and helpful to us in speaking here at our annual meeting last year, and helping with a friend of mine who's got some artifacts from the old Dartmouth area that she wants to find a home for, and he's giving her advice on what to do about that. Jordan has got a tremendous background in the subject that he's going to talk about, including working at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and many other places of that type, doing the work of preserving and conserving historical artifacts and treasures. And among his more recent projects, you've all been reading and maybe seeing the Russell Purrington panorama. He's the man that did most of the work on leading the work on that project. And I'm sure he'll, at some point, answer questions about that later on in the evening. I'm going to turn it over to him. I'll be pushing buttons on his direction, and I'll turn it over to Jordan Berson.
Topic was preserving historical artifacts. That is potentially, I'm ready for my close-up.
Okay. You got it.
It's such a vast topic. You could go down so many routes talking about preserving this or preserving that. I couldn't even decide what to call the presentation tonight, so that just came to me on a whim. You can go to the first slide. As you can see, when you talk about preserving objects, well, what are you talking about preserving? Glass, rubber, leather, metal, sculptures, paintings. It's just too vast to go into. You can go, into great detail on any one of those topics. So tonight I'm going to give you a very broad overview of the common types of things you might have around the house that the average person wants to take care of. Family papers and audiovisual materials and things of that like. So what I've written at the bottom of this slide says that all of these different kinds of objects have ideal storage environments and ways to preserve them long term. But working at the museum, we have all of these kinds of objects and more, and we have to find a happy medium. Not to mention the fact that in a museum we have patrons who wouldn't really like it if it was 45 degrees. So we try to keep temperatures sort of stabilized, optimal for the larger group rather than individual kinds of things. But if you have a lot of a certain kind of thing, you can certainly focus on those and give them more specialized storage environment. Next slide, please. So temperature and relative humidity are a biggie. You don't want yo-yoing temperatures or relative humidity. With yo-yoing temperatures and relative humidity, you have a variety of possible problems. On the bottom left, you'll see a photo of a scrimshaw cribbage board. And what has happened there is, it's a mixed media object. Wood and ivory react differently to climatic changes, particularly rapid fluctuations. And if the wood expands or contracts more quickly than the inlay will throw itself out of the object. And in the Whaling Museum collections of scrimshaw, we have a vast number of scrimshaw boxes which are not only wood and ivory, but also mother of pearl, metal, and all kinds of other shell, all kinds of other materials that each react independently of one another. So it's very crucial to keep the environment very stable. Even if it's not the ideal temperature or relative humidity, it's almost better to have it at a bad temperature or relative humidity in a stable way. However, once you hit 60 degrees, and this seems to have reformatted on this screen, I apologize, but if you seek to keep temperatures between 65 and 72, that's a good range for objects and people. You'll see a little later audiovisual materials. Many of those should be kept at a cooler temperature. In the case of film, when you encounter deteriorated film, it's best to freeze them. Relative humidity. Once you hit 60% relative humidity, you're liable to see mold activity. So you certainly want to keep it below 60 degrees. And if you go too low, you end up with dried out objects, paintings that crack, furniture that checks. So it's good to keep it somewhere between 45 and 55. And again, don't let it yo-yo. If you need to, implement humidifiers or dehumidifiers as necessary. And there are some very, very good climate monitors on the market that are really turnkey. You don't have to analyze them. They actually digitally record the temperatures and relative humidity, and you use a little thumb drive to take the information out of these boxes, stick it in your computer, and it'll graph. You can plot, you can track the temperature changes over the course of a day, or a week, or a month, or if you just want to look at last year, or compare last year and this year. So you can really get the data you need to hone in on where you have deficiencies in your climate control. Next slide, please. A big problem, especially with printed matter and paper, is light sensitivity. And I've seen a lot of examples of people bringing faded prints or other artworks or inked documents that have been framed, glazed, and put near a window where light several times a day with the rotating earth strikes very specifically through the glass and fades the inks and the pigments of the inks and dyes. And there's nothing you can do to reverse that. It's kind of sad when you see something that's really great that's been ruined in that way. Even the paper itself becomes degraded under direct light. So it's definitely good to keep your documents and artwork out of windows, out of direct light, and in the dark as much as possible. If you want to show off a piece of artwork for a dinner party, put the light on then, but take it off. Don't just leave it on all the time. So it says here, light damage is cumulative and irreversible. That's true. So if you have a really bright light for a short time, it does the same amount of damage as a dim light over an extended period. That's why museums don't allow flash photography. Certain types of light are less damaging than others. Ultraviolet light is the worst kind of light. It does the most damage. It's not even visible to the human eye, so it's really unnecessary. You can filter it out with UV filters, put them over the bulbs that you have. That will help the situation, but again, no light is better than even a little bit. At the bottom, you'll see there are a lot of different products on the market to assist with light control. Everything from light monitors, which will tell you if you have a problem, ultraviolet light monitors that will tell you if you have excessive UV light, filters, the new bulbs that they make, especially companies that specialize in supplying museums, are a better kind of light, and with fewer photons. The photons are what cause the chemical reaction. Rheostats, which is basically a dimmer switch. Motion sensors. What we have at the museum is sensors, so the galleries are dark. If nobody's in there for a while, they'll just be dark. And it's slightly disconcerting to walk into the room, but the minute you step over the threshold, the lights go on, so that's okay. It saves the objects. And the old-fashioned way is cloth display covers. I don't know if you've ever been to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. They have a lot of historic documents in cases in regular ambient light, but there's black velvet draped over the tops, and it says lift and replace the velvet after you're through looking. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you go back one? What you see in the bottom photo here, this is called an ADI test. This is these are different patches of wool fabric with different kinds of blue dye, which are highly light sensitive. And what you can do is put one of these ADI test strips in a case and cover half of it so that over time you can look underneath and see if there's any change from the left to right side. And if you have significant fading on the left side, you know you should do something about your light. Next slide, please. So there's very simple things you can do to prevent disasters, and I'm guilty of this myself. I put some of my favorite family photos in the attic of the house, and guess what happened? They were perfectly dry for a while, and then there was a leak. So don't put your collections in the attic. Not only are you risking water exposure, but often attics get very, very hot and cold in the winter. Don't put your collections in the cellar unless you like mold on your prized papers. Avoid storage under pipes and other water sources. This is something you might not think of, but if you have a pipe rupture or a toilet leak, where are your precious documents? There's no reason to keep things next to a radiator. That will cause fluctuations in what is called a microclimate. Every room has microclimates. Inside this fireplace is a microclimate. In a box, in that projector is a microclimate. Behind the drapes, so next to a radiator is not a very good microclimate. Fire suppression systems, if you have a very significant collection, that could be something to consider. Of course, they're expensive. At least have a fire extinguisher. I worked at a very small historical society. I was trying to help them bring their facility up to the modern age. They were in an old wood-framed schoolhouse, much like this. And I arrived one day to do an assessment for them, and they had to open the doors and let the bats out first. And the first thing I noticed was there was no fire extinguisher, and that's something you can buy at Sears for like 20 bucks, and you might be able to save your entire facility. It's worth having. And they had also confessed to me that they had a fan that overheated just a few days before. And if nobody was there to unplug it, it could have caused a fire. And this may sound self-serving since I work at the New Bedford Whaling Museum and I'm the director of collections. I tell this to people all the time. It's better to give your precious artifacts to a repository that can take care of them, particularly if they warrant long-term preservation. At the museum, we make everything available to our donors and the descendants of our donors in perpetuity, and we have a pretty good storage environment. So, it's a way to, keep the legacy of your family intact and, ensure the long-term preservation of the materials and make it available to not just your family, but future generations of researchers. Next slide, please. So, I'm sure you've all heard the term acid-free or archival. Acid-free does mean something archival doesn't. The word archival there's no standard for that definition. Anybody can say this is archival, this is archival. But acid-free, if you're being truthful, doesn't contain acid, which is damaging to papers. So when you're purchasing things like boxes, storage boxes or folders, make sure you're buying acid-free archival quality materials. This photo here was a sheet of paper that came out of a collection that I rehoused for the Louisiana State Museum in New Orleans. What you see in the corner was this thing had dog-eared, so this piece of paper had folded over and was stuck in between two very acidic pieces of paper for about 85 years. And when I opened it up, you could see that the rest of the paper had discolored. That was the result of what's called acid migration. If you put a good piece of alkaline paper next to an acidic piece of paper over a long period of time, the acid will actually migrate from one document to the other. It'll make the acidic paper less acidic and the alkaline paper more acidic. And because that little corner was protected from the acidic paper, it didn't get darkened. Fasteners. In Louisiana, particularly prior to air conditioning, it was really soupy and humid. And I found this actually came off that collection. You can pass it around and you can see what this stuff looks like. In fact, these two paper clips might be in that very jar. You don't want that on your papers. It causes damage, staining, and actually I've seen examples of the rust eating straight through the paper and leaving holes. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, what would you suggest?
If you have to use fasteners, they do sell inert plastic fasteners, but generally, unless you really need to, you just remove them. From the same collection, I removed this from a box. That's a good example of how not to pack your papers in a box. You should give them plenty of room. Books, a lot of people don't realize this, but the book on the shelf, that you grab that, the top edge and pull it out, that's like the worst way to store a book and the worst way to pull a book off the shelf because you could tear the spine. The structure of a book just naturally likes to be on its spine, but recognizing most people don't like to keep their libraries with the spine down, but if you really have a special book, either flat on its side or on its spine is the best. Because the sewing structure gets compromised, it gets weakened over time, and then the text block in the boards sag, and you have a weak attachment. So store your papers with breathing room, use pH-buffered archival folders, interleaving, and correct size boxes. What we have here is a rather expensive product, but you don't go through it that fast unless you have a vast volume of papers, but it's a pump spray that sprays a calcium, like powdered calcium, at the paper, and it will help to neutralize acidic paper. One thing to note is once paper is brittle, that's irreversible. It can be washed, believe it or not, in a bath, and you can flush out a lot of impurities out of the paper fibers. The result will be orange-looking water. And the mechanical attachments of the paper fibers will be reinforced in that way, but it will still be brittle. So you really should sleeve them at that point or give them some kind of support. Often, if you have if your paper so brittle is already fractured, you can use this very, very delicate heat set tissue, low tech. You use a household iron or a tacking iron, which is a tiny little iron, and you can position all the pieces as they should be and tack this liner to hold everything in place and put it in a Mylar L sleeve, meaning open on two sides. This is a document here, part of the French colonial records, absolutely priceless documents. These records filled a room this size at the Louisiana State Museum, and every single one of the documents was scotch taped by the WPA in the 30s. And this is what happens. Never repair anything with tape, because over time the tape degrades, the adhesives darken and stain. They actually leach into the paper, and it's a big undertaking to remove it and get all the stains out, if it's possible at all. Next slide, please. A lot of people ask me about taking care of audiovisual materials. There are some very simple rules for that. LP records, 45 records, 78 records, always stand them vertically. You've seen record shelves like that, I'm sure. Tape reels are also upright if you have old reel-to-reel recordings. Film reels are, on the other hand, best laid flat because when they're vertical, they tend to deform around the core. So they're much better long-term flat. Photographs. How many of you have seen those albums where it's like you peel the plastic back and you stick the photo on and it's kind of tacky and you cover them up? Don't ever, ever, ever use those. They, like all other adhesives, that is a low-tech adhesive, much like Post-it notes, which are also a no-no. And what happens with that adhesive in the albums is it gets, it almost petrifies, and you can't get the pictures off the backing again. And it stains in these little lines. You can see these little lines, these stains in your photographs. So it's best to sleeve all your photographs in inert plastic like Mylar. CDs. So discs. A lot of people in the 80s were transferring their home movies to VHS and then throwing out their films. Well, that was a big mistake because film has a much, much longer shelf life than VHS tape, which wasn't even good when it was new. And what happens with magnetic tape is over time, the magnetic layer on the carrier, which is a plastic strip of tape, actually starts to delaminate, and the information starts falling off the tape. So, now a lot of people are doing the same thing, putting things on discs, but compact discs are still, even though they've been around 30 years, it's a relatively new technology. I mean, we don't have a long history of watching these things degrade to know what's going to happen, but what we do know is some of the cheaper compact disc stocks that were offered over the years are already degrading to the point where they're unplayable. The recommendation is to use preservation grade discs which look golden color because they are actually gold plated in the back. But the verdict's still out on how long they'll last. They have a far longer shelf life than the regular discs, but save your films if you transfer them, because you might be able to transfer them again in the future to a more modern format. You don't want the generational loss or risk of losing all the content with damaged digital media, which is, for all intents and purposes, irretrievable, or if it is, very costly. Next slide, please. I've been told that we're not having good Wi-Fi here tonight, which is a shame. I was going to show you some online reference sources and show you how to navigate them, but I'll describe them to you. And a few of the websites I actually have on the next slide are for suppliers that I brought catalogs for anyway, so I can, after I'm done speaking up here, you can come over and look at some of the materials I brought. www.nedcc.org, that's the website for Northeast Document Conservation Center. They're in Andover, Mass. They do book and paper conservation as well as prints, anything paper. And they also do digital audio transfer from disc. They have a very interesting machine that can optically read old degraded sound discs and digitize them. NEDCC.org has a wonderful selection of self-reference conservation and preservation guides. If you're looking for information about something specific, chances are they have a very user-friendly guide that you can refer to on their website. Another good source for interesting conservation write-ups on various topics are the National Park Service conservograms. I'm sorry that I'm not going to be able to read you that whole website, but I think if you use Google and type in conservograms, you'll go right to it. Library of Congress, loc.gov/preservation. They go into a variety of topics, but most notably audio-visual, and there's a good read about audio discs if you're looking to do sound transfer or preservation recordings of any kind. And the very bottom website is conservation-us.org. That's AIC, American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. That is the main conservators' professional website and professional organization. There's a feature on the home page that says Find a Conservator. You can, let's say you need to get a painting conserved. You can go to Find a Conservator, type in your zip code, and type in a mileage range, and it'll give you the names and phone numbers of all of the AIC-associated conservators that work on paintings. And if you have sculptures, you can look there as well. Photographs, leather, ethnographic objects, just about anything you can think of, you can find a conservator there. And I would not suggest looking anywhere else for a conservator, because anybody who's a member of AIC is sworn to a code of ethics and a high standard. So that's really the place to go for quality talent. Next slide, please. And here are some of the archival suppliers, things that you can buy and have shipped to your home, and you can rehouse your papers, your photographs, your audiovisual materials, your textiles, all kinds of products for storage and long-term preservation of your things. Gaylord Brothers has been around a very long time. They started off a library supply company. They're in Syracuse, New York. They ship very quickly. And their catalog is gigantic. Look at that. And I invite you to take a look at this, and you can simply call them and order one of these. They'll send it to you. And everything from boxes to good packing materials if you want to pack some of your artifacts in boxes. This is how they're showing to pack historic dresses and textiles away. And you can buy everything that you see in these pages. And University Products is very similar to Gaylord. They're actually in Holyoke, Massachusetts, even closer. I don't know whether it's just habit. I've just been using Gaylord for so many years. I generally go there, but University Products is excellent. In fact, if you have to buy anything, it's worth looking at all of the suppliers because I've seen price fluctuations. Some of the prices are really good for some things, and so at times I've even split orders to get the best deal. Light Impressions, they are in Rochester, New York, home of Eastman Kodak. They do photo and display supplies. Anything to do with photographic storage supplies can be found there, although Gaylord and University also carry those products. Hollinger Metal Edge is more specific. This is their catalog. This is a miniature version of their product, Metal Edge archival boxes. And they come in flat boxes with lids. I mean, there's a lot of different configurations. It's, again, a pretty thick catalog. They also have, I don't know if you can see this, these little like boxes for small artifacts. If you have jewelry or gemstones or whatever it is, you can get little boxes with dividers. And Master Pack is something that I guess maybe you wouldn't have as much occasion to use at home, but if you're at a museum, they come in handy. They sell these big, well, I'm not seeing it here. For instance, these archival tubes, if you have very large things that need to be rolled up, whether they be cloth or posters. Posters are best kept flat. Most paper is, but recognizing that most people can't dedicate a room in their house to giant flat files, there are solutions for that. And I think that's the end of it. Is that the last slide? So I'm happy to take questions, and I'm also happy to do some show and tell with you all. Probably those two will go hand in glove, questions and showing you solutions at the table over here. Yes, sir?
Hey, Jordan, when you were talking about lights, you were talking about some of the newer sources of light. What's your take on LED lighting? Because that's been very popular to replace, typical incandescent bulbs. Yeah, well,
I'm not an expert in LED light, but what I understand about it is it's like no UV, and it's a lot of light without a lot of the light energy. So you can get more bang for your buck, less damaging, and certainly no heat. So if you want to use them in display cases, it won't elevate the temperature in the microclimate of the case. That's something that we have to consider at a museum is, okay, the room is this temperature, but what's going on in there? I've seen display cases so hot with lights that paint was falling off of paintings that were in the cases. I've seen that happen before, even though the gallery itself was fine. So the LEDs give the advantage of low heat, low UV, or no UV. Yeah.
What about framing artwork? There's low UV, very low UV, museum quality,
right,
etc.
Well, it's really expensive stuff. So if you're buying a poster at SeaWorld, I mean, you probably are not going to want to spend $400 to frame it. Right. On the other hand, if you have, a first edition print and you want to really protect it, you can get the UV glazing. Another expense is the no reflection UV glazing, which is almost like a frosted, but not frosted that you can see it. It simply eliminates glare. So it really, depending on the kind of glass you buy, depends on how expensive it gets. You know, in some places the glare doesn't matter, and in some cases the UV protection doesn't matter.
Well, does the UV protection in that glazing make it all right to put the frame in the light?
Yeah, I mean, are you going to stick it in the window, you know, where the sunrise comes up? And probably not. I would say that why would, no, you shouldn't do that either, because light does get through. It's just reducing the UV light. I mean, the light itself is still damaging, but the most damaging kind of light is UV. There's a lot of very sensitive dyes and pigments and inks that will fade, you know, under any prolonged exposure to UV light. So that's why the glazing is good to have UV, and of course the lighting, if you can reduce the UV there, why not? Yes?
What about paper conservers, people who can deal with foxing and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, they commonly can, and again, I would strongly suggest if you're looking for a conservator to go to the AIC web page and find somebody in a driving range that you're comfortable with, but I wouldn't go to anybody who's not associated with AIC. And that includes me. I used to be a member, but I'm not practicing now, so and it's expensive to be a member, but you know, people that are really up on their game, it's a rapidly advancing field, and it takes ongoing learning to stay you know, up on the new technologies and methods. And you know, a lot of people go to a frame shop, and the frame shop, not to make an example, but what they do, somebody brought a poster to me today that was mounted on this dry mount board, and it's very, very, if it's possible to remove it, it would be very difficult and expensive. But what it's done is it's caused deformation in the work that's been put onto it. And, you know, again, I've seen the word archival used with that stuff, but it's not archival. I mean, it's not what you'd like to think archival is, which is a standard for long-term preservation. It may not have acid in it, but it's not an archivally approved method. A conservator would never dry mount something or laminate something. And that's why you have to go to a real conservator to make sure that you're getting what you're paying for. Yes, sir?
If you have things such as we have upstairs, there's a variation in temperature and humidity here. Would you recommend putting those things in a fairly tight cabinet?
That's one way to do it. Again, microclimates can be less severe. Although I can't recommend a wooden cabinet, wood does act as a buffer. It regulates temperature. It keeps a more even temperature and relative humidity than does metal, but the problem with wood is it off-gases. So what is recommended for archival storage or museum collections is powder-coated or enameled metal shelving. But that doesn't give you that regulation in temperature and relative humidity the way that wood does. But there are ways to do it. I mean, there's desiccants you can put in a case. There's we can get into detail with that. We can have a conversation about it, but you know, it's one of those topics that you can go on and on all day. There are ways to do it. Yes?
Jordan, we haven't said much about the panorama, and I know that there's probably quite a bit of interest in some of the stories about that project.
Right.
So if you
Well,
want
how
to
many
say-
people, show of hands, have seen the panorama this summer? Most of you. Good. Well, it's up till October, well, Columbus Day, which is the 8th or 9th. So see it. It's free, and bring your family. We've had 20,000 visitors this summer, which is quadruple the number that came to see it between the combined 1960 and 61 seasons. Probably because they charged money back then, but the response has been tremendous. I will tell you that what you see this summer, if you were able to see it all those years ago, is better than what you saw all those years ago because it was in pieces, it was wrinkled, it was damaged, and now it's really quite beautiful. The museum had the painting since 1918, so it's kind of poetic that on the 100th anniversary of our taking custodianship of it, we've been able to unveil it to the public for the first time, really, in really fine shape, as fine as it's been since the 19th century. 20 years ago, 2001, 17 years ago, they started to look at the painting to figure out, how to approach it in terms of conservation, because it was chopped into 13 different sections. Just to be clear, it's a 4-roll painting. Everybody knows what it is, right? It's a painting that scrolls across the stage like a movie. On 4 rolls, it was presented to audiences. So when we got it, it was on 7 rolls, but in 13 pieces. So you can imagine trying to figure out what pieces were on which rolls and in which orientation. And the rolls were all misnumbered, and we had nowhere to spread them out. You couldn't lay them out to try to piece them together in the proper way. So it took a lot of forethought to just strategize how to get them onto the proper rolls and in the proper orientation. What we ended up doing, the first major problem with the panorama was that the paint was falling off the cloth, which is a very thin cotton sheeting. The paint was old and dried out. And we scoured the ends of the earth for solutions to this problem, and we discovered that the St. Louis Art Museum had recently conserved their panorama, and what they did was they used a very dilute gelatin solution. It's kind of like Knox gelatin, but highly refined with no impurities. And we put it into a solution of warm water and sprayed it through what's called a dahlia sprayer that gives a fine, even mist. And we sprayed the entire painting with this mist of gelatin that, once dried, acted as an adhesive and re-adhered the pigment to the cloth. And then we were able to handle it. Then the work became the whole, excuse me, tears and the holes and the overall textile repairs, and putting the 13 pieces back together. One of the other problems with the panorama was that over the years, some of those 13 pieces had been used in different standalone exhibitions, and they had been trimmed, so the top edge of one section was about a foot shorter than the rest, and there were things like that. And we had to do fills to make up for the lost fabric, so when it went back together, it was the right orient, it all matched each other. Excuse me. And finally, in 1976, 2 50-foot sections of the panorama were hung at the museum and ended up hanging there for about 30 years, but they were backed with this heavy plastic sheeting that had to be removed. So there were a lot of little sub-projects, thank you, within the overall conservation treatment. A lot of different areas to figure out solutions for. And well, the end result is it's back together again, and the spray adhesive, which had water in it, actually served to take out a lot of the wrinkles, so it really looks fantastic. And we took the opportunity at the same time to digitize, photograph the entire thing in high def. We have a very talented, able to using photo software to stitch all the images together. I see we have a brochure in the back of the room here. And now you can actually look at the panorama without touching the real thing. So that's, in a way, part of the long-term preservation strategy, making it accessible without having to handle it. And finally, we were able to put it on bigger diameter drums. It was on very skinny little spools that meant it was like kind of wrenched around itself. And we built this rack system that has all kinds of bearings. So it has very smooth unrolling and re-rolling capability, and it has casters, so you can actually move the rolls around, and and suspend it without, you know, wrenching the painting or manhandling it. So we've solved a lot of problems, and it's really now positioned to live another 100 years with limited intervention. So it's a pretty cool thing. I advise you to see it.
When's the next time you'll bring it up?
Well, there's no plan to. Part of it might go on loan. I honestly think it may be a once-in-a-lifetime chance to see it in its entirety. You know, one of the biggest challenges was finding a place to show the whole thing. We took over the top floor of a textile mill, if that's any indication. You can put an aircraft carrier in there, and it's expensive. Not only did we have to find the space, but we had to get air conditioning installed and cover all the 68 windows. I mean, it was a major, you don't see it when you walk in, but to get to that point was just a mammoth undertaking. Any other questions? Yes?
Where are you going to store it once the display is over?
We've already made a space for it at the museum. It'll be behind my desk. Well, thank you all very much, and I invite you over to the table. I'll show off some archival materials and catalogs, and
We have refreshments.
there's refreshments. Thank you.